With me is Respect MP for Bradford West, George Galloway. George, welcome to Going Underground. The argument goes, as we know it so well, we elect a Prime Minister, he and his cabinet decide on war. It's not up to big parliamentary votes because he's elected for the interest of the state.
Well, of course, we don't elect a Prime Minister. We elect members of Parliament who, amongst themselves, choose the Prime Minister and can dispose of him without any further recourse to the electorate at all. That's why we don't have a presidential system. If you had one, if you had a written constitution in which these powers were clearly delineated, that would be one thing. But we have a constitution which is unwritten and which evolves, and it has already evolved in the last two wars, one of which we said yes to and one of which we said no to, that the Parliament itself will be the final arbiter on whether or not the country goes to war. In fact, hitherto, the Prime Minister was exercising what's known as the royal prerogative. You see, theoretically, only the Queen can make war. She, over the course of centuries, or he, when it was a king, gave that power to the Prime Minister in his or her stead. But Mr. Blair changed the unwritten British Constitution.
He still went to Buckingham Palace, presumably, for the Iraq War.
Yes, but if the British Parliament had stood up and been counted in the way that they now wish they had, there would have been no British participation in the Iraq War. And thus, David Cameron, when he wanted to take us to war with Syria, made it clear that the Parliament would have to make the final decision. And when it voted against British involvement, the Prime Minister was very clear. He came to the dispatch box. Somewhat to my surprise, I wasn't 10 feet from his face when he said it. He said, that's it. The Parliament has spoken. Britain will not be involved in any military action against Syria. And I must tell you, my heart was never so filled with joy on any parliamentary occasion. So I don't think Parliament, having now got this power, is going to willingly or easily give it up. You know the old American song, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Well, we've seen Paris, we've had the power, we're not going to give it away.
In that instance, do you think David Cameron, as he was standing there, thought, right, there's a legal requirement that Parliament votes? Because, of course, as you said, it's an unwritten constitution. Indeed, there is no legal requirement.
There was no requirement to have a vote, and there was no requirement to accept the vote. But the political realities and the parliamentary realities were that he could do no other. You see, in that debate on the Syria war, one could almost feel the House moving and turning. He lost the debate comprehensively from the first kick of the ball and right up until the final whistle. And it would have been political suicide for him, inside his own party, inside the Parliament, and most especially inside the country. Because the country's public opinion, there was only 11% supporting a war on Syria. That means 89% of the people were not in favour of a war. You can't have a war with only the 11% support.
David Cameron signalled that he would try and get some kind of act, some bill through about the need for a vote. And now he's saying no.
Well, I think a signal in politics doesn't always really mean an intention, certainly in British parliamentary politics. He's playing to the backwoods of the right-wing Conservative Party, differentiating himself from the Liberal Democrat coalition partners and preparing a set of cards with which to go to the electorate not very long distant from now. This is a government running out of time, running out of popular support, and riven with internal conflicts, not just on this, but on Europe and many other things. So I think it was just a bit of play acting by him. We'll see if I'm wrong. But I must tell you, if the British Parliament votes to give up the power to decide whether Britain goes to war or not, it's not a parliament worthy of the name.
In that case, the whole idea of democracy itself, you're saying, is going to be affected.
Unless we're going to have, and I've long campaigned for it, a written constitution, a Bill of Rights, and abolish the monarchy and have a president with executive authority, I would prefer that. And then you could have one man making the decision for a limited period of time, like President Obama has, to go to war or not. But if you don't have that, you can't have a Prime Minister who isn't elected by the whole country. He's only elected by 75,000 people in Oxfordshire. That's the only mandate he actually has.
But then why is Cameron now signaling, as it were. I mean, it's too much of a conspiracy that Washington are going to him and going, we really didn't like this vote on Syria.
I don't.
It's about time you actually enshrine the idea that the Prime Minister can take the
I
country
think
to war.
to the contrary, that the United States was mightily relieved, the administration was mightily relieved that the British Parliament voted the way that it did, and was mightily relieved at Russian diplomacy opening a door to a peaceful resolution of what looked like the brink of a catastrophic war throughout the region. I just arrived back today from Lebanon. I wouldn't have been able to go to Lebanon. No one would be able to go anywhere in the Levant or farther afield because we'd now be in the middle of a full-scale, raging, catastrophic war.
That's obviously not what the intelligence told the Prime Minister when he set forward that motion in
Well,
Parliament.
I wonder. We've found out now over Iraq, and you'll see when the Chilcot inquiry reports.
When will it report?
Well, that's a very good question. I hope I'm still around to see it report. But when it reports, I can give you this insight into it. It will show that British diplomatic and intelligence information to the Prime Minister was very different to that which the Prime Minister was repackaging and presenting before the public. And I'm never one to speak up for intelligence services, but they have a right to be sore about how they were sorely misused by Tony Blair.
I mean, when a Liberal Democrat peer says things like introducing a legal dimension to the idea of the country going to war would create an area of morass rather than certainty, which is why we shouldn't require Parliament in order to have wars, you immediately think, well, maybe the security services got to him or to other lords. It's not the security services, in other words.
Well, I wouldn't have thought so, because they seem to have rather more sense than the government does. As do the American intelligence services seem to have rather more sense than their government does. And I never thought I'd find myself saying either of those two things. Actually, the real clear and present danger to Britain is its government. The clear and present danger to the United States people is its government. And the people that we employ to be experts in this field, we later find were giving the right advice to the politicians who weren't taking it. No, I mean, I'm very clear about this. If we're going to have an unwritten constitution, then one of the few arguments in favor of it is that it gives flexibility to the parliament to get a government off the hook. That's what we did in the vote on Syria. People know that every war we've fought since the Second World War has been wrong, has done more harm than good, has cost blood and treasure we can't afford, and has, in the case of recent Middle East wars, cascaded fanaticism and extremism around the world, which explodes even in our own country, on our own underground trains and on our buses. And people know that instinctively. Somehow, the British and American people have seen through the fog of war propaganda, Fox News, Sky News, all of that. They've seen through it, and they're not going to go back on that. They realize that when British and American politicians tell them they need to go to war, they better pinch themselves and think not twice, but 102 twice before going along with such a proposition, because the wars were a blunder. You know, the French minister Talleyrand, when told of the death of a political opponent,
Bismarck
said it's a crime, but it's worse than a crime, it's a blunder. The Iraq war, the Afghan war, the proposed Syrian war would have been crimes, were crimes, but they were worse than crimes. They were a blunder.
But the defenders of any policy to reduce the sovereignty of Parliament or kill off the sovereignty of Parliament when it comes to war say, if you do that, you're aiding the enemy because you're giving them time to regroup for the fight against British soldiers.
Well, wars waged in haste are the worst wars of all. There's an ancient Chinese proverb in the Forbidden City. It was the motto of one of the great emperors, and it was, do nothing. Oftentimes, it's best to leave events to develop before making a judgment as rash as plunging into a war, because wars are very easy to start and very difficult to finish. The Afghan war has now lasted longer than the First and Second World Wars put together. And frankly, it's a long, long way from being finished. So that's hardly an argument for giving the Prime Minister unlimited, untrammeled power to take the country to war, that we can do it more quickly. After all, if that's what we'd done over Syria, we'd be in the middle of a war that demonstrably we didn't need to be in. because diplomacy is now fixing the problem that we were told we needed a war to
They say the
fix.
threat of the war made that happen.
Well, I just don't accept that.
Isn't that what President Obama says and David Cameron says?
Even if that were true, that's an argument for threatening war. It's not an argument for actually waging one.
Thank you, George Galloway, for going underground.
Always.